Chris stumbled down the bridge, his steps heavy and unsteady, the result of too much alcohol and a burdened heart. The night was cold and still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of traffic. Chris's mind was a cacophony of thoughts, none of them comforting. The doctor's words echoed in his head, sharp and unforgiving. "I'm sorry, Mr. Simmons, we did everything we could, but you can't have children. But hey, before we dive into the story, do yourself a favor and pause the video right now. Go hit that like button, and let's see if we can make this video reach 1,000 likes. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to your favorite story channel. Also make sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss out on the latest and weirdest stories. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming your way. So sit back, relax, and prepare to be amazed as we take you on an unforgettable ride. Don't forget to engage with us in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Without further ado, let's dive right in. It wasn't just the news that had driven him to drink. It was the culmination of years of effort, years of building a life he thought would one day be filled with the laughter of children. He had it all, or so he thought. The expensive car, the sprawling mansion in an elite neighborhood, and a bank account that would never run dry. But what good was any of it if he couldn't share it with a family? As he neared the bridge railing, Chris leaned over, staring at the dark, cold water below. The idea of ending it all flickered in his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to jump. "Maybe I should try New York after all," he muttered, remembering the doctor's suggestion of seeking a second opinion, but even that seemed like a hollow hope. Just as he was about to turn away, a strange noise caught his attention. It was faint, almost drowned out by the night, but it was there, the cry of an animal, or so he thought. He turned his head and saw a woman standing a few yards away, holding a baby in her arms. She was thin, her clothes shabby and worn, and her posture spoke of utter despair. Chris's heart clenched at the sight. Abandoning his own dark thoughts, Chris took a few steps toward her. "Hey, what are you doing?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't even think about it. You're young and beautiful. Whatever's going on, it's not worth it." The woman looked at him, her eyes dull and lifeless, as if the world had long ago drained the light from them. She didn't respond, but the baby in her arms started crying again, the sound pitiful and weak. Chris moved closer, his concern deepening. "You should feed him," Chris suggested gently. "Why is he crying? Is he hungry?" The woman sniffled and shook her head. "I can't feed him. I don't have any milk." "How's that possible?" Chris asked, bewildered. "I don't know, I just don't," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Chris felt a pang of sympathy for the woman. She looked exhausted both physically and emotionally. "Well, if you can't breastfeed him, we'll get him some formula. Come on, let's go to the store." The woman looked at Chris warily, but she didn't refuse his offer. Together they walked to a nearby supermarket. Inside, Chris began filling a cart with everything a baby could need: formula, diapers, wet wipes, even some food for the woman herself. As they shopped, he learned her name was Linda, and the baby was Tommy. She had been abandoned by her fiancé when he found out she was pregnant, left to fend for herself and her child. Chris felt a surge of anger at the thought of anyone abandoning their child. It was a betrayal he couldn't comprehend, especially given his own situation. "I can't understand how anyone could leave their own child like that," he said, shaking his head. "It's unforgivable." Linda just shrugged. "I grew up in an orphanage," she said quietly. "I'm used to being on my own." Chris watched as she carefully chose the cheapest items on the shelves, trying to stretch the little money she had. No, he said, pulling out his credit card. "Get the best stuff, don't worry about the money." Linda hesitated, but then smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. She nodded and started picking out better quality items. Chris paid for everything and then called a cab, deciding it was safer not to drive after drinking. "Where are we going?" Linda asked nervously as they got into the taxi. "To my place," Chris replied. "Don't worry, I live alone and there's plenty of room. You and Tommy can stay the night." Linda looked out the window, her face a mixture of hope and fear. When they arrived at Chris's house, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Is this your home?" she asked, her voice full of awe. "Yeah," Chris said with a small smile. "I built it from the ground up after I started my own company." The taxi driver helped them with the bags, nodding respectfully at the impressive mansion. Chris carried Tommy inside while Linda followed, her eyes darting around. taking in the grandeur of the place. Chris led her to the living room and started unpacking the groceries. "Why don't you get Tommy settled while I make us something to eat?" Chris suggested. Linda nodded and took Tommy to a nearby room to change him. Chris quickly whipped up an omelet with bacon, setting the table for dinner. When Linda returned, she looked more relaxed, though still a bit overwhelmed by the situation. They ate in relative silence, Linda devouring her meal as if she hadn't eaten in days. Chris watched her with a mixture of pity and admiration. Here was a woman who had been through so much, yet she was still standing, still fighting for her child. After dinner, Chris showed Linda to a guest room. "This is the nursery," he said, opening the door to a beautifully decorated room. "I had it made years ago, just in case, but I never got to use it. You're welcome to stay here." Linda looked around the room, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found us." Chris smiled gently. "It's no trouble at all. Just get some rest. You both need it." Linda nodded and put Tommy in the crib, watching as he drifted off to sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the soft blankets, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Meanwhile, Chris retired to his own room, the exhaustion from the day and the alcohol finally catching up to him. But as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Linda and Tommy. There was something about them, something that stirred a long-buried desire within him, the desire to be a father, to have a family. The next morning, Chris woke up early and made breakfast. He had a business trip to prepare for, but his mind was preoccupied with the thought of leaving Linda and Tommy alone. As they ate, he hesitated before speaking. "Linda," he began, "I have to go out of town for a few days for work. I was wondering if you'd be willing to stay here and look after my cat, Church. He's a bit of a handful, but I think you'd be great with him." Linda looked surprised. "You want me to stay here?" "Yes," Chris said quickly. "It would be a huge help, and you and Tommy would be safe here. No need to worry about anything." Linda bit her lip, thinking it over. "I don't want to impose—" "You wouldn't be," Chris assured her. "In fact, it would give me peace of mind knowing you're here." After a moment, Linda nodded. "Okay, I'll stay. Thank you." Chris smiled, relieved. "Great. I'll make sure you have everything you need before I go." Over the next few hours, Chris showed Linda where everything was and how to take care of Church, who had already taken a liking to her. Before he left, he handed Linda a set of keys. "Here," he said. "These are for you. Make yourself at home and don't hesitate to call me if you need anything." Linda took the keys, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Chris, for everything." Chris nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions as he left the house. As the taxi drove away, he looked back at the mansion, knowing that something had changed. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt lighter, more hopeful than he had in a long time. During his trip, Chris couldn't stop thinking about Linda and Tommy. He called every day to check in, and each time Linda sounded more at ease, more like she belonged. By the time he returned home 3 weeks later, he knew that he didn't want them to leave. He walked into the house, holding a bouquet of white roses, and found Linda in the living room, playing with Tommy. Church was curled up next to them, purring contentedly. Linda looked up as he entered, and her face lit up with a smile. "Welcome back," she said softly. "Thanks," Chris replied, his heart swelling with emotion. He handed her the flowers. "These are for you." Linda took the roses, her eyes filling with tears. "They're beautiful. Thank you." Chris sat down next to her, watching as Tommy reached for the flowers, his little hands grabbing at the petals. "I've been doing a lot of thinking while I was away," Chris began, "and I realized something. I don't want you and Tommy to leave. I want you to stay here. With me." Linda looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. "Chris, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Chris said, taking her hand. "Stay with me. Let's be a family." Tears spilled down Linda's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Chris, I'd love that." A few months later, Chris and Linda were married in a small, intimate ceremony. Their friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate the union of two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected of circumstances. For Chris, it was a dream come true. His once lonely mansion was now filled with love and laughter, the pitter-patter of Tommy's little feet, and the soft purring of Church, who had found not one but 3 new best friends. And as they stood together, Chris knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along, a family to call his own.